Welcome back to Forgotten Realms Reviewed. I am the Leech, and today we'll be talking about Mortal Consequences by Clayton Emery. It's the third book of the Netheril trilogy, and this is book number 3 of our semi-chronological read-through of the novels of the Forgotten Realms. As always, there is a link in the description to the order in which we will be reading through these books, if that interests you. Without further ado, let's get started. Endgame. The Netherese Empire will collapse in 5 generations. A forgotten foe, armed with a hell-spawned source of destructive magic, returns to seek her revenge, and a lost love is found in a most unexpected place. Against a backdrop of war and chaos, the barbarian Sunbright struggles to carve out a niche for himself and his people in a rapidly changing world. Alright, to start off, this first part of the video will be a spoiler-free review in which I will give my impressions of the book as a whole and a 1 to 5 star rating. That way, if you haven't read the book, you can know if it's worth reading or not. Then, once you have read the book, come back to this video and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. Okay. So our heroes Sunbright and Knucklebones return from the second book of the trilogy, Candlemas is also here in a minor role, and we pick up almost exactly where the ending of Dangerous Games left off. Sunbright and Knucklebones are traveling in search of Sunbright's tribe, the Rengarth Barbarians. Meanwhile, a forgotten foe, as stated on the back cover, seeks revenge on our protagonists. Now, I'd like to praise this book for having possibly the most focused story of the trilogy, where the first book was awkwardly lurching from event to event, with the reader having little idea of where the story was going, and the second being an endlessly forward-driving romp towards an inevitable end of the story, with several awkward asides. Mortal Consequences maintains focus on the main goals of both the protagonists and the antagonists through to the end. However, this does not mean that there aren't issues with the book. Despite the focus, there are several parts that hit a lull and had me barely wanting to turn the page. Emery knew where he was going, but at times goes through the doldrums to get there. I think this issue could have been fixed with some simple abbreviation at these parts, getting the reader back to the more interesting parts of the book sooner. That said, once the reader climbs out of these lulls, the book is enjoyable until that next lull comes along, but it pales in comparison to the page-turner that was the second book. With that said, I am going to give this book a 3 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed this book, but over the course of the series, I found that I simply don't care too much for the characters, and that in combination with sometimes lacking of pace, leaves this book with a lower score than it could have achieved otherwise. Overall, I'd say the Netheril trilogy is pretty much entirely skippable. If you're interested in the fall of the Netheril like I was, I'd actually recommend the AD&D sourcebook Netheril Empire of Magic, and the tie-in adventure module How the Mighty Are Fallen. These 2 books tell the tale of the Netherese better than Emery did in his second book, albeit in less of a story and more of a historical or informational way than a novel. Alright, now let's get in and pull this book apart a little bit. I want to warn you though, from this point on the video will contain spoilers. Turn back now if you haven't read the book. The bad. What really brought parts of this book down for me was Sunbright's brooding. The doldrums I spoke about, those are all parts of the book where Sunbright loses hope and mopes about. I understand that this is part of his character, maybe why I really don't care for him so much, but for the sake of the story, this could have been kept to a minimum. Acknowledge that he's down in the dumps, and then move on. Now, I identified with Knucklebones on this. I couldn't imagine actually having to deal with Sunbright's emo phases. Now, after he comes out of these slumps, the book carries on fine, and it's actually rather enjoyable. But there's 3 different times where he's just depressed for a chapter or 2, and for me, that is 3 or 4 chapters way too many. With this simple problem addressed, this book could have easily been 4 stars. Then there's the characterization of Knucklebones, which I think again takes a turn for the worse. In the first half, maybe the first 3/4 of Dangerous Games, she was represented as a cold, hard survivor. I understand that being around Sunbright, her lover, will bring out a softer side of this character. However, I cannot stand by as a strong female character is reduced to nothing but complaining about feeling alone while with her mopey man. I understand that having someone you love be depressed will put a damper on your day. I understand. But this is all Knuckle cares about, aside from finding somewhere to belong, which I also understand. But again, strong female character reduced to just almost moping like her lover. This is what I think is Emery's biggest weakness: character development. Sometimes he stumbles onto great character moments, but overall his characters just aren't compelling. They devolve into two-dimensional stereotypes of character. Wow, I really didn't mean to rip Emery a new one on this video. I did enjoy the book, but I mean, anyway, that addressed. Let's move on to what I enjoyed about the book. The good. I really enjoyed the monster bits. I love how it turned out to be Sisquemelin from the first book, although I totally saw this coming from like a mile away, and that was in part due to the description on the back cover saying, "An old foe that you've forgotten about's coming to get you," I totally saw it coming. But nevertheless, the scenes where she was unleashing hell on one poor soul or another, those were the parts of the book that kept me turning the page. From her using the One King's image to cause havoc for Netheril, or her attack on Polaris, giving us a kind of like transition between the high and regal Polaris of the first book to the overweight and paranoid Polaris of the second. Every time I got to read about the monster Sisquemelin, I was a happy reader. I also enjoyed the bits where Sunbright was actually leading his tribe. Not all the times where they were failing to follow or he was failing to lead, but when he was actually making good decisions for the tribe and convincing his tribe to follow. Awesome. I really liked the chapter detailing the success of the trifecta of the barbarians, the elves, and the dwarves, in the plains, the forests, and the mountains, in their corner of Netheril. It was great. All of these parts coming together, it was as if Emery actually was setting up another story to follow. Like cogs in a clock, Emery described how each element of that developed area worked together. And he set a solid foundation for the groundland culture in Netheril, or at least in that part of Netheril. And it was really nice. And I thought he was going to bounce off of here and start giving another story about Sunbright actually being a shaman. The result of this book was also a high point. Sunbright defeats the monster using a sword crafted by the dwarves and blessed by the elves using elven steel. Of course, the true reason why Sunbright was successful was because of the blessing the elves laid on him personally, the little trinkets they put in his hair and on his clothes. But at the end of the day, he was successful. Green Willow's soul was... It actually seemed to be bothering Knucklebones more than Sunbright, but it was revealed to be reincarnated in Knuckle, which I totally called in the last book. You can watch my last video, as I called it. But finally, Sunbright, he becomes a true shaman. He has his family, his friends there, sort of thing. But he leaves the heroic fighting behind and leads his people to become horse riders. He leads them to their future with the help of the... what was his name? Halil and his horse riders. All of this, even more, increased my want for a new story with these characters. I wanted to see Sunbright as a shaman, not a heroic hero shaman that he's been doing in the past book, at least. And I didn't want Knucklebones to be, moping about beside him. I wanted to see him in his rightful place as a shaman. I wanted, more so. I wanted Candlemas to magically come back and them to have an adventure together where they all are serving in roles that make sense. Unfortunately, there is no next book, and we will never see the superior story that it seemed Emery was setting up in this book. The meh? Now we come to Candlemas. Poor Candlemas. I was really hoping that we'd get some great interplay between him and Sunbright, and I'm still disappointed that we didn't. Especially considering the fact that in the last book, Emery made great strides towards making them an unlikely duo archetype. one being all bumbly and being Candlemas, and Sunbright being the heroic, let's go get him, but not really knowing what's going on, and then flipping that on its head. It was great, and I wish they could have had that, or wish we could have seen that in the next book, but it didn't happen. Sadly, we see Candlemas only for a brief amount of time before he is dispatched by the monster Sesquemlin. However, I really like his demise in its raw detail. He simply ceases to be. His mind, his body, his soul, all blinking out of existence in his desperate last attempt to escape this monster that's chasing him. Now, having it happen so quickly and without recourse, it left a lasting impression. And me, I'm actually a fan of Candlemas and his bumbling, and his demise left a gaping hollow where closure should have been. But this isn't a superhero comic book. Characters can die, and permanently and suddenly. And it was just so real. I enjoyed it greatly, even as I lamented the death of a good character. And yes, I thought he was actually a good character. Disagree with me. Lastly, in this novel alone, Emery seems to somewhat abandon the magical side of the setting to focus on telling the story of Sunbright and his barbarians. Magic is still a part of the book, considering Monster Sesquemlin and her magical attacks, but it takes a backseat of the story as a result. However, considering the fact that I came into this series hoping to learn more about the Netherese, it comes as a bittersweet fact to me. I still long for a good solid story about this ancient civilization of the Netherese, but I doubt that'll ever happen. Nevertheless, putting magic on the back burner was a good move for this story. Alright, so that's it. What did y'all think about the book? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you fall somewhere in between? Leave your comments down below. I'd really like to hear your thoughts, and any feedback you have for the channel as well. If you use Goodreads, then consider joining the Forgotten Realms group on there by clicking the link in the description. There you can follow along on our journey through the novels, with updates letting you know when we're starting the next book. You'll also be able to read my written review as soon as I finish each book. Remember to click the like button if you like this video, and consider subscribing if you'd like to see more of this content. Now that said, I will be taking a little bit of time off from the series for the time being. This is in no way me abandoning the project. I will be back. I just don't necessarily have a timeline for when the next video will come out. I may address why and what I'll be doing in the meantime in a separate sort of update video. But that said, when we return, and we will return, I will be bringing you the review of Elminster: Making of a Mage by Ed Greenwood. Until then, farewell.